When it came to politics, 2018 was an eventful year in Saskatchewan. We have our political reporters Stephanie Taylor and Adam Hunter here for a look back. Stephanie, what was the biggest story for you this year?
I think the biggest story was the Justice for Stolen Children protest camp. It's always fun to cover stories out of the legislature that the government wasn't planning on bringing up. It wasn't on the agenda, and we certainly saw that with the protesters' presence for upwards of 6 months right outside the legislature. Their presence did a couple of things. It put the government on the spot to talk about issues that we don't hear it talking about all that often. So social services, the treatment of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, its relationship with First Nations leaders. And I don't think there was a person in Regina who didn't have an opinion about the justice camp, about their presence, about the reason that they were there, and have an opinion about what the government was doing. And I think because everyone was so engaged and that they had an opinion, was the government doing the right thing by evicting them, was the government doing the wrong thing, that makes it the biggest political story because it's something that got everybody talking about. And it's also worth noting that it put a new premier on the spot about what he was going to do with a rather unexpected situation.
It did. Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. Adam, what was big for you this year?
I think we have to start with the two leaders being elected. Scott Moe becoming premier by becoming the leader of the Saskatchewan party in a really tight race there, edging on Alana Cook. And then later, a couple months later, Ryan Miley knocking off one of his caucus colleagues in Trent Wotherspoon to become the NDP leader. This is a fresh start for both parties. It breathed a bit of new life into the political scene here in Saskatchewan. And it was going to be, I guess, interesting to see how Scott Moe took over from Brad Wall and took on his fight against the federal government with the carbon tax. And we've seen that now over the last number of months. The Scott Moe's popularity has gone up according to recent polls. And he's one of the most popular premiers in the country. And that has a lot to do with his fight against the carbon tax because it's unpopular here in Saskatchewan and many parts of the country. And you have his stance on pipelines, saying that the federal government's not doing enough to get pipeline projects off the ground. So those two major national issues have given Scott Moe more of a profile and maybe one he wouldn't have had becoming a new leader and having to fill in the big shoes of Brad Wall.
Thanks, Adam. So, Stephanie, what was a story that you think should have gotten more traction this year?
I wouldn't say it shouldn't have gotten more traction, but one thing that stuck out to me that didn't get talked a whole lot about was what the NDP thinks about what Saskatchewan should be doing around emissions, reducing emissions, and climate change. Just to rewind a second, on the campaign trail, I remember Ryan Miley, and Adam can remember Ryan Miley also saying that when he talked to constituents, even those in rural Saskatchewan, that they thought climate change was important. They wanted a government that was moving on that file. And right before this session got underway, we saw the NDP at their policy convention, or they put out a plan when it came to renewals. But when session actually got underway, it was kind of crickets. We didn't hear them ask the government a whole lot of questions when it came to climate change, what they're doing about emissions. And as a reporter, my question is, why aren't they doing that? Are they doing it because they know that the government is quite popular when they do talk about their opposition to the carbon tax and how that could be costing people more money? That's not entirely sure, but I find it quite interesting that for a new Democratic party to not be talking about climate change or pushing the government in power to do more or even bringing it up as an issue. We saw them kind of hammer home on opioids and mental health. I don't know why climate change wasn't more there.
Adam, anything else that stuck out for you?
I think the issues that people want to talk about a lot of times, especially with the provincial government, are the three big things that cost the government money, which is education, social services, and healthcare. And in the last sitting of the legislature, as we mentioned, we heard a lot about pipelines, a lot about carbon tax, and not a lot about those three core issues. And I anticipate that we'll hear a lot more of that in the next few months because that's the stuff that really affects people's lives, and that's what the government pays for. And that's, as I said, a huge chunk of their budget comes from those three main things.
And Stephanie, speaking of going forward, 2019, what do you think are going to be the bigger issues?
Well, I think the government's lawyers could be kept quite busy. In February, we do have the reference case going to court. That's about the government challenging kind of the constitutionality of the carbon tax that the federal government plans to levy. But there's a couple other issues that could end up in court, and we're kind of seeing rumblings of that. One has to do with its jurisdiction on First Nations around pot and around cannabis. We saw the Muscopine First Nation open their own cannabis store. They didn't have a permit, or they weren't awarded one of the province's permits, but they say, hey, we're in the right to go ahead and do this. The other one is the trespassing law. The government has tabled that legislation. We're going to see debates around that possibly pass next year. And First Nations group, including the FSIN, saying this is going to end up in court because it could infringe on the treaty rights of Indigenous hunters. So a couple court cases that I think we might see go forward.
Adam, what do you think is happening in 2019?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Stephanie said there with the reference case, that is still going to be hanging over really the federal government as well as the provincial government, because it has to do with the carbon tax, which will be implemented in Saskatchewan on April 1st. Then we have to look ahead to the budget, which is going to happen just a couple weeks before that in March. The government says they're going to get back to a balanced budget. That's been their 3-year promise. So we'll see what cuts are made, because cuts will likely have to be made to get down to that balance. And then fast forward to the fall and the federal election. That's a major, major story here in Saskatchewan because of all of the back and forth with the federal government and the provincial government to see if there is a government change, and if not, what the implications of that are.
Thank you so much for being here today with me.
Thanks, Erica.
That was Adam Hunter and Stephanie Taylor, our political reporters.